Today we're going to start Unit 3 on the Renaissance and Reformation, kind of the beginning of the modern world. So this unit is going to pick up where we left off at the end of the Middle Ages and take us all the way to the Enlightenment, which started in the year 1700. So we're going to cover around 300 years with this unit here on the Renaissance and Reformation. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is the 100 Years' War. Now, this war lasted over 100 years. You imagine a war lasting that long. This was a series of different conflicts between England and France over who would control the French throne. Now, England and France have historically been enemies. They have pretty much always hated each other, always been fighting each other in different wars, especially with the 100 Years' War, which is basically England versus France for over 100 years. But then, all of a sudden, in the 20th century, during the World Wars, they became allies and really have been ever since. So, kind of a turn of events in history there. But at this time, they were definitely enemies, and the 100 Years' War was all about who would control the French throne. So, you have 5 generations of kings from the English and French rival dynasties fighting for the French throne over the course of 116 years, and that became known as the 100 Years' War. So you have generations passing away during this war. It's just lasting so long. Consistently, the goal is to claim the French throne. The English wanted to usurp it, and the French wanted to keep it. Now, both sides brought in allies. It was not just England versus France. For example, Scotland fought for the French because Scotland did not like England, and Portugal fought for the English because Portugal did not like France. All right, so both sides brought in allies, just like happens with a lot of other wars here. So the war was mostly fought in France, as you see in the map there. The bulk of the fighting took place in France. Okay, you have like the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 was one of the most well-known ones. Then you have the Battle of Orleans, which is where Joan of Arc fought. We'll talk about her in a minute here. But this war was fought mostly in France, also a little bit in Great Britain, and some, as you see on the map, in Spain as well. So the results of the 100 Years' War, plain and simple, the French won. Finally, after 116 years, the French won, retained control of their kingdom, fought it back from the English, and the English lost and abandoned all of their territories that they had acquired in France. So if you see this map right here, this is 1337 at the very beginning of the 100 Years' War. And all this area in the green belonged to England. So you have part of France up here, then you have part of France down here that belonged to England. So England said, let's take over the rest of France and control this as our rightful territory. Here you see several years into the war that the British made a lot of advancements and made a lot of gains, territorial gains. This is later on in the war as well, around 1429. They made a lot of gains in the north. That's around the time of the Battle of Agincourt, as I said. But finally, France did repulse the English and kicked them out of their region. So this ended up strengthening the French monarchy and also caused greater nationalistic divisions between England and France. They started to dislike each other even more, all right? So the English became very proud to be English, to belong to that island, and then the French became even more proud to be French because they were able to defeat the English and maintain control of their homeland. Now, this war also led to the decline of chivalry and feudalism, all right? Because you have a lot of feudal armies being replaced by national troops with the 100 Years' War. Since you have all this large-scale fighting, which one is going to be more effective? Small, localized feudal armies or large, centralized national troops? So this is the part where the Middle Ages really ends, and you start having a lot of large-scale national, international wars once again. Now, I mentioned Joan of Arc. She's very famous, and she was a soldier, a French soldier, during the 100 Years' War. So she helped to fight off the English at the siege of Orleans. The French pronunciation is Orléans, and that is where New Orleans comes from. Okay, you had the French settlers who came to America, founded that city, and called it New Orleans, based off of the city Orleans in France. So she was there fighting at the siege of Orleans. Later on, she was captured by the English and put on trial for a variety of charges, all sorts of different things that she was found guilty of. And when she was found guilty by the English, she was burned at the stake. She was burned alive, one of the worst possible ways to die, just a tragedy that such a young person, especially a woman, had to go through that. But yes, she was burned at the stake at the age of 19 after she was found guilty. But after her execution, or since her execution, she has been remembered very positively by history. About 25 years after her death, once the Hundred Years' War was finally over, her trial was re examined by neutral parties, and it was concluded that the people who conducted the trial had been corrupt and her punishment had been unjust, that she did not actually deserve to die. At that point, she was then declared a martyr, which remember is someone who dies for religious reasons, and later she was named a saint. So she is seen as one of the patron saints of France, Joan of Arc. Now we're talking about a very important guy named Johannes Gutenberg. Now, when I was a kid, I remember in the year 1999, I was watching this TV special called The 100 Most Influential People of the Past Millennium, the past 1,000 years. So in 1999, the millennium was coming to an end, and this TV channel did a special about the 100 most influential people from the years 1000 to 1999. And number one on the list was this guy, Johannes Gutenberg. He was incredibly influential, so much so that he actually was given the top spot on that list. So he was born in a place called Mainz, which is in modern-day Germany. And at this time, it was a principality of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember talking about the Holy Roman Empire with Charlemagne. It is still around at this point in the 1400s, and that is where he was from. Now, he was a German blacksmith, right, someone who worked with metals and iron, and he invented the movable type printing press. This is seen as the most important invention of the past 1,000 years. It absolutely revolutionized the world, right? So this is what it kind of looked like. You would forge these letters through his work as a blacksmith. He would forge these letters and then kind of move them and arrange them to make words and sentences. Then you would lather it with ink and press it onto a sheet of paper. Now, one thing you probably notice about this is that the letters are backwards. The reason why they're backwards is because then when you press it onto a piece of paper, it is forwards, right? So you had to forge the letters backwards and be able to arrange them correctly. Also, if you've ever heard the phrase "mind your P's and Q's," it's something that old people say sometimes. Basically means mind your manners these days. But back then, it literally meant mind your P's and Q's. Because if you look at this letter right here, it looks like a P, but it's actually a Q. All right, so you had to make sure that your P's and Q's were correct when you were using a printing press because you had to read all the words backwards. All right, now if you think about it, this would take a really long time to get all of this organized here. It would take more time than just writing out the sentence or the document. However, once you do all that work on the front end, you can make as many copies as you want. You can make thousands and thousands of copies of that one document without having to do really any extra work. You just lather on the ink again, press it again, lather on the ink, press it again. You don't have to rewrite things like you did before the printing press. Now, Gutenberg's printing press completely changed the world. It was around the year 1440 when he invented the printing press, and it's seen as the beginning of the modern world. It's what ushered in modernity, so to speak. And it allowed writing to be mass-produced. For the first time, books could be mass-produced. You didn't have to wait 6 months for the next book to come out, all right? It was being mass-produced. A lot of people could get literature into their hands because it was so fast to be produced. And it also allowed for writing to be distributed around the world since so much of it was being printed. And this increased literacy levels. Finally, after many centuries in the Dark Ages, as we call them, where literacy levels were very low, finally people are starting to learn to read again, and that's largely because they have material to read. They actually have stuff they can read because of the printing press. So this led to increased literacy, and it also led to the spread of ideas, a lot of new ideas at this time that would not have made much of an impact on the world had it not been for the printing press mass producing their ideas in print. It also laid the foundation for the modern knowledge-based economy and the spread of learning to the masses. So you have things like the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, all sorts of different movements that were kind of born out of this one invention. Without this one invention, all of those things, yeah, they still might have happened, but they wouldn't have made a big impact on the world because the ideas would not have been spread to other people. So the printing press was absolutely huge. Johannes Gutenberg, one of the most influential people of all time. Now we come to a guy named Zheng He, and he was Chinese. He was a great Chinese mariner. He was a seafarer, a sailor. And between the years 1405 and 1433, he led 7 different voyages throughout the Indian Ocean. This was the most important ocean in the world at the time, and this is where a lot of the trade happened. Remember the Silk Road? A lot of the maritime routes, the ocean routes, were through the Indian Ocean. So he sailed with 300 ships and 27,000 crew members. That is just a massive fleet, right? If you just look at this model here of his ship, right? This is a replica of one of his ships here, how big it is. And just to scale it, this right here is Christopher Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria. All right, so just look at the difference in size there and think that Christopher Columbus had 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and Zheng He had 300 of this size. All right, so you can understand why you would need 27,000 crew members. So he was very, very skilled at sailing, and his voyages weren't so much about exploration like Columbus's were. They were much more about trade and really connecting China to the rest of the world. So the Chinese really became world leaders in naval technology at this time. They started to dominate trade in the Indian Ocean throughout the 1400s. Throughout the 15th century, the Chinese were the dominant force in the world, because this is after the Mongol Empire declines from prominence, but before the Ottoman Empire does. So at this time, China is really the center of the world. But then, by the end of the 15th century, by the end of the 1400s, China essentially abandoned shipbuilding. All right, they stopped. They stopped building ships. They stopped all their voyages, stopped this outreach and trade by the end of the 1400s. They got a new emperor in the Ming Dynasty, and he basically said, this is not what China's going to be about anymore. And so by the end of the 1400s, you have China becoming very isolationist, which is shown most clearly by the Ming Dynasty building the Great Wall, which was around this time. So if you really look at the 1400s, right before America was discovered, you would think that China would be the one to discover America, and they probably would have if they hadn't abandoned shipbuilding by the end of the 15th century. But because they put it to an abrupt halt, that is why Europe kind of got the upper hand, and Europeans were the ones to discover and colonize the Americas, not the Chinese. So just think about how different of a place the world would be if the Chinese had not stopped building ships and had been the ones to discover America first. All right, just think about how different the world would be today, how different America would be. So now we get to Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus was an Italian explorer, and more than anything, he desired to find a more direct route from Europe to Asia. Because before this time, or at this time I should say, if you wanted to get from Europe to Asia, you had to go around the southern tip of Africa, okay, around the Cape of Good Hope. And that was a really, really long journey, to the point where it almost wasn't worth it to trade with Asia. But of course, Europeans wanted things from Asia, and this was around the time where the Silk Road had really, really stopped because China had become isolationist. So Christopher Columbus and his crew knew that the earth was round. That's a common misconception about Christopher Columbus. There's a lot of things that people believe about Christopher Columbus that are just false, and this is one of them. That some people say that he thought the earth was flat and that he would fall off the edge of it if he went too far. That's actually not true at all. He and his crew knew that the earth was round. However, Columbus just thought it was much smaller than it actually is. So he believed that there was just going to be ocean between the western coast of Europe and the eastern coast of Asia. Okay? He thought he would just sail west, and eventually he would come into contact with Asia. All right, so that's why when he came to the Caribbean, he called them the Indies, because he thought he had found Indonesia or close to India. All right, so he knew the world was round, but thought it was much smaller than it was. So a long time he struggled to find funding for this expedition because he was not a rich person, but he wanted to explore and discover the lands to the west. And finally, two people, Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs of Spain at the time, agreed to fund Columbus's expedition in the year 1492. Now, Columbus convinced them to fund his voyage by promising to do two things. He promised to obtain riches from the new land, okay, that once he got to the new world, he would get riches for them and bring them back. And two, he promised to convert the natives to Christianity. Okay, so both things that the Spanish monarchs wanted to be done. They wanted to get rich, and they also wanted to convert other people to Christianity. So they agreed to fund Columbus's voyage. So Columbus set off on his voyage with three ships: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. So the Santa Maria was the one that he was on. Now, the immediate results of his 1492 expedition were pretty simple here. Okay, he had very little technology to guide him, hardly any technology. He basically had a compass and an inaccurate map, and that's it. So he was a very skilled navigator. Some people say he was just a lucky idiot. That's also not true. Okay, another myth about Columbus: he wasn't an idiot who just happened to find or stumble upon something. He was a very skilled navigator. Just the fact that he was actually able to find something and sailed directly west with such little technology. So as he sailed west, the first place he landed was a Caribbean island that he named San Salvador. Okay, so that's right here on the map, San Salvador. Okay, so he did not land in the modern day United States. He landed in the Caribbean, but that's still part of the New World, so to speak. So San Salvador is what he named it, and when he landed there, he thought he had landed in Indonesia, okay, which are called the East Indies. And that's why people later on called this land the West Indies, because it's in the Western Hemisphere, but they're similar to the islands of Indonesia. So that's another reason why the people that he encountered there, he called them Indians, because he thought they were from the Indies and not from this new continent. He didn't know this continent existed. Now, this discovery affected both Columbus and the Spanish monarchs. So, unfortunately for them, no spices or gold were found like Ferdinand and Isabella had expected. So they were a bit disappointed with that. There weren't a lot of riches from that land that he could bring back like they thought he would discover. But Columbus would then go on three more journeys to North America, three additional journeys to the Caribbean, and he began to establish colonies there. Now, he did make good on his second promise. He did convert a lot of natives to Christianity, but it is historically debated as to how he did so, whether by force or not, or by choice. Okay, that's still historically debated by historians. Another myth about Columbus is that he committed genocide on an entire race of Native Americans. Now, to be clear, it's not like Columbus was an amazing person or anything, but he wasn't totally evil either, like a lot of people today say. He did not commit genocide on Native Americans. However, whenever the English came over, they did bring a lot of diseases. Okay, so with those diseases, a huge percentage of the Native Americans died. So yes, a lot of Native Americans died as a result of Columbus landing there, and that's horrible. But we shouldn't say that he committed genocide, because he didn't try to wipe out the entire race, and that's not really what happened. Now, there were a lot of people who died, and like I said, that's horrible. And there were some that he killed, like with conquest, but we call that conquest. We don't call that genocide. That's not trying to conquer, or not trying to wipe out an entire group of people. Okay, so people who say that Christopher Columbus is Satan, okay, it's a little exaggerated. Okay, he was not that bad. He wasn't a great person, but at the same time, we shouldn't make him out to be the villain of this story. Now, Leif Erikson, as we talked about last unit, was the first European to discover the Americas. Remember, he landed right up here in modern-day Canada in Newfoundland. But Columbus's discovery, even though it was many centuries later, was more important to world history. So Columbus's voyages led to the first lasting European contact with the Americas. Other people followed him after he went on his voyages. You have a guy named Amerigo Vespucci, which is why we call it North and South America after him. You have a lot of other people who followed his lead and kept exploring the New World and kept making settlements there. Eventually, the English came in 1607, established Jamestown, and that's really what started the 13 colonies in America. All right, so this ushered in a time of exploration, conquest, and also colonization that lasted for several centuries. So his discovery really opened up the Americas to Europeans and changed the course of world history forever by kind of connecting them, by connecting the two halves of the world, the Western Hemisphere with the Eastern Hemisphere. So after Columbus's discovery, people began to use these two terms, the Old World and the New World. And as you see on that map there, the Old World, that is Europe, Asia, and Africa. And the New World is the Americas. Okay, so North and South America, including the Caribbean and Central America. That's what we call the New World and the Old World. And shortly after Columbus made this voyage and kind of opened up the Americas to Europeans, something called the Columbian Exchange began. And this was the new forms of trade and globalization that occurred after Columbus's discovery of the New World. So after he discovered it, no, he was not able to bring back any gold or spices, but there was a lot of really good stuff in the Americas that Europeans had never before seen. Okay, a lot of food that they had never tasted, a lot of animals they had never come into contact with before because they were unique just to the Americas. All right, so a lot of different things were spread along the Columbian Exchange. You have animals, plants, diseases, and people. Those are the four categories of things that moved from east to west and from west to east along the Columbian Exchange. So this is like the new Silk Road, so to speak. All of them were spread either from the New World to the Old World or vice versa. You have people migrating both ways. You have new plants, new animals migrating both ways, and you also have diseases coming into the New World. All right, so things like smallpox and the measles and the plague, all right, the Black Death, all that traveled west with the Europeans, and unfortunately, a lot of Native Americans were killed just for coming into contact with them and getting the contagious diseases that they had no immunity towards. So yes, very unfortunate consequence, but at the same time, we shouldn't just see the Europeans as villains there, because a lot of the deaths were unintentional. So at this time, a lot of crops and animals, as I said, only existed in either the Old World or only in the New World. So there were a lot of new foods that were introduced to people for the first time along the Columbian Exchange. So Europeans brought wheat and grapes to the New World, along with other things. Here's a big map of different things they brought to the New World, things that Native Americans had never seen before. And among them are wheat and grapes. And that's important religiously because in addition to stuff being brought to the Americas, Europeans also brought Christianity. And wheat and grapes are essential to Christian worship because of communion, okay, the bread and the wine of communion, Jesus' body and blood. You need wheat and grapes to make that. So with the spread of Christianity in the Americas, you also had the spread of wheat and grapes and all of these other things that were brought to the Americas. And then you also have the New World introducing things like corn and beans and potatoes and tomatoes to the Old World, things that they had never tasted before, never seen before. Right? They had never seen an avocado or peppers or anything like that. They had never seen peanuts before, or pineapples, or potatoes or corn. Just like the Native Americans had never seen pigs or cows or chickens or all these sorts of things that we still eat. All right. So this exchange permanently reduced starvation in the world. Starvation was a huge problem in the world before the Columbian Exchange. But with the Columbian Exchange, yes, you do have the negative impact of the diseases, but you have the really positive impact that this permanently reduced starvation in the world. Now, as I said, since the Native Americans had no immunity for diseases that had started in the Old World, over 50% of the native population of the Americas died of European diseases, things like smallpox and measles. Now, this led to the end of two great empires, the Inca and the Aztec Empire. So the Inca were right here in modern-day South America, Peru, Chile, that area, and then the Aztecs were up here in modern-day south-central Mexico. Right now, the disease left them much less equipped and less populated for battle, and their leaders kept dying. Okay, so not only did they die from the disease, but it also made them weak and susceptible to European conquest. Now, Europeans and Africans then repopulated the New World after this. Obviously, the Europeans by choice, the Africans not by choice. Okay, and we'll get into the Atlantic slave trade and other things like that later on. All right, so that is 15th century Europe and what resulted from the discoveries at that time.